I'd like to welcome you all. This is Nickel at Noon, and I'm delighted to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, and it's with gratitude that we share this space and welcome you all here today. And I can finish, there we go. Next slide. This is Nickel at Noon, the online edition. We've been coming live to you every Thursday from 12 to 1 via Zoom. And I think we're going to continue with Zoom for a while yet. We're actually developing the fall program already and kind of anticipating that we'll continue with Zoom for a while. Fortunately or unfortunately. All the details about our programs can be found on our website. You're also welcome to follow us on your favorite social media platform, assuming you have a favorite social media platform, or you can subscribe to our mailing list and just reach out to Marla or myself and we will make sure to add you. And this is just a reminder that for the very first time, Nickel Galleries is part of Giving Day. And while we wouldn't expect any contributions from students, if you have been enjoying these programs, we would love to hear from you and love to encourage you to participate in this wonderful giving opportunity. The university will match donations up to a certain value. Anyway, more information on our website, and clearly Michelle feels really awkward presenting that, but there it is. For today, please keep your microphones on mute until the end of the presentations. We're going to hold the questions and comments until the end. It's just a little less disruptive for the speakers. Be aware that we're recording and that the final cleaned up version of the video will be posted to the Nichols YouTube channel. There's some wonderful videos there. If you haven't checked it or subscribed to it, you might want to consider doing so. Participant names and the chat are not included in the finished recording. However, if you speak, your voice will be recorded. I'm Michelle Hardy, and I'm a curator with Nickel Galleries. I'm also the coordinator for Museum and Heritage Studies and the facilitator, so many titles. Facilitator for the Museum and Heritage Studies Practicum. I'll talk about that in a moment. Marla Halstad is our front-end manager and the co-host. She comes out every Thursday and helps us with the technology. Thank you to Marla. We have one more Nickel at Noon coming next week, April the 22nd. It is Archives from Home. A group of colleagues from the library's archives are going to be talking about some of the wonderful treasures that they have in the collection. It should be a real treat, kind of behind the scenes opportunity. But today's extra special presentation is Museum and Heritage Studies 533 Practicum presentations. We have 5 students today, and I'd just like to say a few words about the program and who's involved. First of all, I'm so pleased to offer these students the chance to share their thoughts, to share their learning over the past few months. The program, Museum and Heritage Studies 533 Practicum, is intended as the capstone course in the University of Calgary's undergraduate minor in Museum and Heritage Studies. It's an opportunity for students to gain valuable work experience in the sector, connecting classroom theory with real-life experiential learning. It's also a chance to reflect upon the working environments, challenges, and opportunities that exist within this field. Students commit 80 hours of voluntary work on projects related to their interests and skills, as well as their hosts' needs. Obviously, COVID has affected all of our lives, not least Practicum students who've all had to work, for the most part, work remotely. The 5 who'll be sharing their findings today are to be congratulated on their perseverance, creativity, and patience. I know that Practicum didn't look like what many of us have seen in the past, but their virtual projects have been worthwhile and very valuable nonetheless. Before introducing the students, I want to thank the many institutions and individuals who've hosted our students and provided such generous mentorship. This term, we want to specifically acknowledge Jason Niesenson, the Assistant Archivist, Archives and Special Collections at the Military Museums, Dick Averns, Curatorial Coordinator at the Founders Gallery Military Museums, Christine Leopard, Historical Specialist at the Calgary Stampede, Kanika Anand, Associate Curator, Public Programs and Engagement, whoops, I didn't put the place, at Contemporary Calgary, Chelsea Murray, Service Delivery Manager at the Calgary Public Library. I have to say that this was one of the most challenging terms to find placements for students. Everybody's burned out. So these 5 individuals and their institutions really deserve a huge round of applause later, of thanks and certainly our gratitude. And they join a long, long list of institutions and individuals who have hosted our students with generosity and kindness and a great deal of support over the years. So thank you to those individuals and thank you to the students for making it work. So what we're going to do today is call on each of the individual students to speak for about 10 minutes on their experiences, and we're going to go in alphabetical order, starting with Anna.
So, can we all see in presenter view now?
I can see.
Okay, awesome. So my name's Anna Benko, and today I'll be sharing my experience working with the Kananaskis Prisoner of War collection. So my practicum placement was at the University of Calgary's Archives and Special Collections at the Military Museum, with my supervisor being Jason Niesenson. The main goals of my practicum were to, first of all, get a comprehensive understanding of all the material and information within the collection, specifically regarding the personalities, and then to use my findings to create a framework for an online exhibition using the Omeka S software, with the goals of this being an example of how the library in the future could use the software for online exhibitions, as well as to be further developed for interpretive programming at the current site of Camp 130. So a little background on Camp 130. It's also referred to as the Kananaskis Camp or the CB Camp, and it's a prisoner of war camp that was in operation during World War II from 1939 to 1946. And during the time of the camp's operation, it had a variety of different individuals interned there, including civilian internees, merchant marines, as well as German prisoners of war. The site of the camp is the present day location. The present day location of the Biogeoscience Institute, Barrier Lake Field Station. At the closure of the camp in 46, the majority. So this is located in the Kananaskis Valley at the present day location of the Biogeoscience Institute for Barrier Lake Field Station. And so just to give yourself, this is where the Nikiska ski hill is, just to give you some reference here. So upon the closure of the camp in 46, the majority of the buildings were taken down or moved. And so there's only 2 remaining buildings still standing at the site, one of which is the Colonel's cabin seen here, as well as one of the towers. And so this leads me to the collection that I was dealing with. So what I was looking at is about my collection that I was working with. In the 80s and 90s, there was through wanting to learn more about the camp, as well as the personalities that were associated with it through some summer research students, as well as through some grants that were received. There was some deep dives into collecting on the long history of the site. And so the majority of that collection was brought upon by the researchers' goals at the time, as well as looking at visitors who had come to the site who had identified themselves as being a past personality in connection to the site, and then those were reached out to further get their experience. So the majority of the collection includes visitor cards, and also all the letters that were sent back and forth between the researchers and the personalities, and the different documents that were shared. And so this just demonstrates just some of the different parts of the collection. So a lot of images, a lot of things like postcards and original art done by POWs at the camp. And one of the most recent acquisitions, donations, is number 9, just down in the left-hand corner, of a hand-carved model of a ship that was actually done in the wood shop at the camp. So what I was doing is trying to fill out more of those personalities. So my predecessor on the project had created a list of all the different personalities that were found associated with files in the collection that had been brought over from biogeoscience to the U of C libraries. And so then what I did from there is take those lists of individuals and then expand upon all the information that could be gleaned from the documents in each of their files. So this is just a very small clippet of the spreadsheet that I made to track all of that. It's just under 300 individuals, but this by no means shows the full number of the people that were associated with the site. A lot of them were people that have been reached out to through that research in the 80s and 90s. And so I was specifically looking at camp experiences, post-war life, pre-camp war experiences, and then just the artifacts and documents that could be associated with those individuals and their stories. So from here, originally the plan had been to create a kind of fleshed out profile for the top personalities at the camp that hadn't really been outlined, but due to the findings of the research, I decided to go with a more thematic approach for the format of the exhibition, to create a broader sense of the personalities and the overall camp experience. So I created these 4 main overarching categories: camp life, buildings at the camp, camp experiences, and then the comings and goings from the camp. And then within those subcategories that multiple different personalities could contribute their own perspectives on. So from here, I then created and did all the decision making about and selection process of those different individuals, as well as the documents that would go along with that. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen here and just shift and take you on a little behind the scenes of the format that I did through the Omeka S software here. Okay, so hopefully we are all seeing a camp life image there. Okay, great. So this is that format. So on the top bar are those four main categories, and then within each of those is a drop down. So this is just the broad overarching kind of map of what the exhibition could look like. So none of the text is the actual text. It is the kind of notes and roadmap to the further development based on the selections of the people as well as the artifacts. So I'll just take you through a couple of the different areas. So to kind of show you the broad reaches of it. So here are some of the different work duties that would have been a part of the daily schedule. And I've bolded and underlined all the different personalities that can be associated with that. And just to show kind of the overarching options there, as well as some other things to look at, such as the sports and all the different teams and activities that were done in the spare time. As well as looking at all the different buildings at the camp, such as, and this really gave the opportunity to expand on the different personalities that were there, not just internees and guards, but things like the dentist that was there, and the post office and how mail would have been received and sent, and what those experiences and anecdotes about those experiences would have been. And then lastly, I'll just show you things like the different entertainers that were also there. One such interesting piece that I came upon is this here is a hand drawn ink sketch that was done of Arthur Craig, the piano player seen here, by a prisoner of war, and it was used to barter to get into one of the performances that would have only been accessible to the guards. So that's just a little sneak peek at what I worked on for my practicum. I'd like to thank Dr. Hardy for setting up the practicum, as well as Jason for all of his wisdom and support, as well as being able to facilitate me coming in safely to the military museum to work with the collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was great. And it sounds like there's a lot more to go, but we'll hold questions. I know I have like dozens, but we'll hold questions until the end. And second on my list is Emma de Souza.
All right, so this is my presentation on research and outreach at the military museums this winter 2021 practicum session. So hello and tanse. My name is Emma de Souza. I'm a fourth year student majoring in biological anthropology and getting my minor in museum and heritage studies. Just to put some perspective in what I want to do with this degree is I hope to work in the field of telling Indigenous stories from Indigenous perspectives within museum and academic institutions in the future. So into where I was placed, I was at the military museum, specifically with the Founders Gallery. This was all completed via online remote work. There was some talk about possibly coming into the museum if it opened, but unfortunately we're back in stage 1, so we will have to see how that comes along. I work with Dick Averins, who is the curator of the Founders Gallery, and we worked on an upcoming exhibition set to open. It was fall 2021, but I just heard it's been pushed to winter 2021, so yeah. So the exhibition is on military experiences of Albertans from nations outside of Canada. So people who later immigrated to Alberta after their military service or their experience in conflict. The timeline of our research is within the last 100 to 150 years, kind of focusing on the last little bit, specifically with the post 9/11 immigration going on in Alberta. So here I use the example of my grandfather as what kind of stories we're going to be telling with this exhibition. So these are all of his photos on the side that he took. He was born in Portugal in 1941, and he served 2 years of his mandatory service in the Mozambican War of Independence, unfortunately on the Portuguese side. after his service, he reunited with my grandmother, who had gone to Canada, to Alberta specifically, to start a life for them. So these are the kind of stories we're planning on telling of people who served or experienced conflict, and then why they came to Alberta, or what the draw was, and how their experience was here afterwards. So yeah, these are his pictures, him in uniform, him at his registration day, a picture of a woman that he took while he was there. He took some very interesting photos. And when the day he came back with my grandmother. Ooh. Oh no, I knew this would happen. There we go. So my role in this exhibition was to research statistics on immigration to Alberta within the last 150 years, and develop a plan for strategic outreach, and then conduct that outreach to communities and groups. So there are two parts to the aim of my placement. The first part being the research and data collection I conducted. So I collected data, as I said, on immigration to Alberta, pretty much via Stats Canada, and looked at what nations specifically were coming in and from what periods they were. So if you look at my image, I have everywhere from the 1870s, and I've added a whole bunch of groups and nationalities, and I put down whether they were actively immigrating in which decade and the source in which I got it from. I found specifically that immigration increases during conflicts to Alberta. So these individuals likely participated in military forces or had some involvement in the conflict, whether it be child soldiers or rebels. So these were good kind of people and groups to focus on. With this information, we could then find out what groups were missing in our targeting. So if we were looking at, say, Austria and Albania, we're really focusing on them. As you can see, they're kind of only there in the 1940s and 50s. There's not a lot else. But if we look at closer to Bhutan in the 2010s, that's when we get a new population. We know, okay, we need to look at these people to conduct outreach to. I developed a bibliography of all my sources, some of which will hopefully be included in the further reading resources at the exhibition and online for viewers who come in and see our exhibit. And yeah, like I said, I created the spreadsheet of all the information, which includes which source info was retrieved from, if they were a refugee or a standard immigrant, if the statistics were generally Canadian or specifically Albertan statistics, and their decade of immigration and what population they were from. So my second part of my placement was community outreach, arguably probably my favorite part. I created a strategic list of groups in Alberta to contact with our expression of interest about the exhibition. These included student union groups at various universities, community groups via Facebook, and community websites. And I'm now kind of going into and trying to work with university newsletters, getting our expression of interest in there. Again, I documented via spreadsheet, which is apparently my favorite way to document, to maintain kind of notes about who we're talking to, what groups received our EOI, and where we're at with responses. So this is an old screenshot, but I put what the organization was, how I contacted them, which a lot were through Facebook, which was surprising, the URL when I contacted, and who I contacted, as well as if they replied or if they just saw the message, just to kind of see where we're at with talking with them. So this is a copy of our EOI, our expression of interest, that I've been circulating out to targeted communities. I've been encouraging the communities to spread the EOI among themselves to interested parties that they may know. So maybe older individuals in the community who might not have access to Facebook. Maybe if their friends or family are seeing this, then they can go and say, hey, I know you have a really cool story. Why don't you submit this? Also, another thing was the end goal is to receive stories from these target populations to include in the final exhibition, which has been a little bit slow coming. I think people are not really on their devices or at their computer with this work as much right now, but that's our goal. And I was realizing that this is really fostering really good relationships between the military museum and different parts of the community, showing that we are interested in different populations and yeah, just people who are here, coming here now and choosing Alberta now, and not just past populations whose stories we often include. So essentially what I learned about museums over this practicum was outside of the realm of what I've already worked on, which was exhibit design and document writing for exhibits, specifically with Fort Calgary. This practicum's focus, though, was, excuse me, a bit more on the administrative and research side of museums, which it's hard to kind of talk about in school, I think, and not something I'd worked with because it's not necessarily, I think, what people think the exciting part of museums. So that was really valuable experience to get. I also learned that museums really rely heavily on communities and visitors. I assumed that they did, but that it was more of a, we were providing to them rather than them really providing their stories and their artifacts to us. So that really changed my perspective. And that professionals from multiple backgrounds outside of museums are very vital to creating really fantastic exhibitions that viewers enjoy and find very informative. So with this, seeking out librarians and communications people, these are all spheres that I kind of had to dabble in all of them. And I'm not an expert in any of them. So I could see the value in having different people on site with different education backgrounds and experience. So yeah, so that's my presentation. Sorry if I spoke a little quickly, I'm a bit nervous.
That was great, Emma, but we will hold the questions until the end. I'm mindful of the time and the fact that we have 3 more speakers. So thank you very much for that. And our next presentation is Megan Phelan. And Megan, you have something to share?
Yes, I do.
So
Get
the
that
floor
set
is
up.
yours.
Okay, that's good. Hi, I'm Megan Phelan. I'm a 4th year student at the University of Calgary, majoring in history and minoring in museum and heritage studies. I got to complete my practicum at the Calgary Stampede. I originally wanted to do it in the summer, but as you know, due to COVID, it got postponed. And a big thanks to Dr. Hardy for actually making it happen, because it's what I originally wanted to do, and I really appreciate it. While I was there, I mostly focused in the education sector. So I worked closely with Dr. Christine Leopard, who, as Dr. Hardy mentioned, is the historical specialist at the Calgary Stampede, which was a huge help since she also has a history background like me. So she thought quite similar to my thought process, which made it quite easy to understand what I needed to do. And I also worked with Andrew Morrow and Souza Arthurs, who works in the education sector for the Calgary Stampede. So my goal and project was to create an artifact-based program for a grade 4 class to deliver on March 15th. I had to think of a theme and a thesis kind of statement for what I wanted to teach grade 4 students when I led the presentation. And I also had to decide on 10 to 15 artifacts. So unfortunately, due to COVID, the artifact collection is not available to me. So Christine was a huge help on giving me options what to select once we had a more narrowed down idea of what I wanted to do for a theme. And it also had to tie into other key things, like, as I mentioned in my slide, the Stampede's mission to preserve, celebrate Western heritage, culture, and community spirit. But also there are 5 core themes, which they try to follow as much as they can when they're delivering other education programs. And I got to sit on a few, watching Susan and Andrew deliver them, and I really appreciated it, because as a student from High River, I never had the opportunity to watch Stampede School, so it was a huge eye-opener to what to kind of expect for how they like to format their delivery and keep students engaged while doing it. So some of their programs deal with, say, frontier history, and others deal with Indigenous stories. But my education program in particular focused on the formation and the transformation of the Calgary Stampede. I feel like it's a huge chunk of information that maybe not everyone knows necessarily, even if you're from Calgary. It's a huge history. It's a lot of information. And I thought it was important to talk to students how it's changed. It's not static in any way. I think that's really important for organizations that deal with culture and heritage to be transformative and change with the times, and also their community. So when you do an education program, you focus on the 5 core values, which are listed below: Western hospitality, pride of place, commitment to community, integrity, and Western heritage. So for example, when I did Western hospitality, to kind of tie into my main theme of how is it unique to other rodeos, say in Southern Alberta, and how has it changed since its original formation in 1912, I focused on the Big Four who helped create the Calgary Stampede. And they each donated about $25,000, and that's quite a bit of money back in 1912. So without them, the Calgary Stampede might have not happened. And the Stampede still upholds their charitable actions by encouraging volunteers and doing youth programs like the Calgary Stampede School, and also working as a nonprofit organization. Other themes focused on like Stampede marshals and the white hat ceremony. But I also wanted to talk about more sensitive topics, especially at the Calgary Stampede, since they have such a close relationship with the members of Treaty 7. And it's very important to talk about how that relationship has changed, especially since 1912. So I talked about things like the Elbow River Camp and how they have a recent name change. So it used to be called the Indian Camp, which is not, as they decided with the TP owners that originally sit as board members, that it was no longer acceptable and they wanted to do as a change. So they decided on the Elbow River Camp as a group and voted on the matter. And I also talked about animal welfare practices. As you know, at the Calgary Stampede, it's a huge topic that obviously gets a lot of attention in the media. And it's important to talk that they do practices such as fitness to compete that helps check wagon horses maintain health and welfare. But they also do other things like shorter ride times. So they're always looking for new and innovative ways to ensure the health of Western animals participating in the Stampede. And they want to make sure before and after competing that they're always safe and healthy. So when I did my lesson plan, it consists of 3 components. You have the introduction. So I give basic background information about the Calgary Stampede to kind of get an idea, especially with grade 4. Some might have been to the Calgary Stampede, some might not be able to afford it. So it gives me an idea of what's their basic information. I also talk, before we do artifact handling, a little bit background information about what is an artifact. Well, it's what we assign value to as a society and keep preserved for future generations, and why sometimes when it's more fragile, we need to wear gloves to help preserve it better and keep it safe. So that was a little bit of a 10-minute talk. And then I did artifact handling, which was the main portion of my discussions. So some were on site and some unfortunately were not available because due to COVID, of course, again, it wasn't on site at the Calgary Stampede. So we were able to ship some artifacts, which the students really enjoyed, and they asked really thought-provoking questions, which surprised me because I've only assisted, I've never led education programs. So it was a huge learning curve for me and I really appreciated it. And I was super glad they were super engaged because always there's unforeseen circumstances. You don't know if a class is going to be very talkative or not. So I really appreciated that. So that was about for 45 to 50 minutes. And then I did a journaling activity. So it's basically you sketch and then label, and then students do similar questions like, what is it? Who maybe used it? Why is it used? What's it made out of? Questions like that to get them critically thinking rather than having just me engage and just lecture them, which it's fine, I can do that, but no student wants to sit for an hour and a half and listen just to someone lecture for that long. It's not as critically engaging, and it doesn't get them to think why. It's just taking that information in one ear and going out the other. And also, since it's just this vague, it allows for a lot of flexibility and also adaptability for future presenters, because of course, I'm not going to be there, unfortunately. So I think it's very flexible, especially with online Stampede School. I think it's a huge opportunity for other students, not necessarily from Calgary, that might be from Southern Alberta as a whole. So I think that's a great thing to look into doing maybe permanently after this. So and this is just a brief timeline, just to kind of break down what I did. So mainly researching for the first 2 months, because it's a huge deal. And as a history student, I really enjoy that. I like asking how and why, especially why the Calgary Stampede has changed. And it's mainly to do with its changing community. As you might know, Calgary is much more multicultural now and much more focused on being close with collaboration than it might have been even 30 years ago. I think that's a huge thing. Yeah, so I helped develop it and kind of narrowed it down with Christine, and who met up with me quite frequently, almost every week, which I really appreciated. So as a new student that's never done an education program before or done her own lesson plan, I really appreciated it. And she helped do it step by step. So main theme, sub themes, kind of like doing, of course, like a history paper. So you have your thesis and then your sub thesis for each kind of paragraph. So that really helped me kind of break it down. And then I did a run through to help focus if I needed any help on what to focus on more. So I initially had 9 artifacts that I was going to talk about in an hour and a half, but like I said, the students were very talkative, so I only got to go through 6, which was fine. But yeah, it helped me narrow down like word choice for sure, or phrasing or what not to talk about, focus more on this, and I really appreciate that. And then now I'm doing my public presentation, and I think I learned a lot in just those 80 hours as a student that's only had one other prior museum and heritage studies position at the Okotoks Museum. Some things I learned, very collaborative and technical skills. I got to sit in on a lot of education team meetings and also meet up with Christine, which helped me look at a bigger picture. And of course, formulating and delivering education programs. I've only assisted, as I mentioned, so this was a huge learning curve, and I think it went well. The kids were super talkative, and I really appreciated it. And also keeping students engaged. So whether that be hands-on or asking questions or more critical, creative methods like journaling. So it keeps a different variety, and it keeps a little bit more excitement for the students rather than a simple one, kind of same routine, repetitive, going on and on again. So I wish I could work there again and continue on, but unfortunately it's kind of done. But I couldn't ask for better supervisors for my practicum, and I wish them all the best, and thanks so much for everything they've done for me. And that's it of my presentation.
Thank you, Megan. That does sound like it was a really wonderful experience, and we're so grateful to the Stampede for facilitating you. Our 4th speaker is Nation Tung, who's there, who has been with Contemporary Calgary.
Yeah, so my name's Nishan Tung, and I did my practicum this semester at Contemporary Calgary. I'm graduating this June, minoring in Museum and Heritage Studies as well as philosophy, and majoring in English. So Contemporary Calgary is located downtown Calgary, 701 11th Street Southwest. It's also located on Treaty 7 region traditional territories, the Blackfoot Confederacy, Tsuut'ina First Nation, and Stoney Nakoda. Contemporary Calgary was previously the Centennial Planetarium, which is why architecturally it is quite interesting. It's now a world-class gallery where local, national, and international contemporary art programming is delivered. So it started out with the merging of 3 major institutions: the Institute of Modern Contemporary Art, the Art Gallery of Calgary, and the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art. So these 3 institutions merged, and Contemporary Calgary was born. So the chief curator is Ryan Doherty, and I had the pleasure of working with the associate curator, Kanika Anand. So I'll just go over the vision of Contemporary Calgary, which is the following. We believe in the power of art to transform the places and the lives we live. We share a passion for art that is relevant, meaningful, and challenging. We share a passion for Calgary to be a global city of choice. And that's it right there. So the current exhibition that's on at Contemporary Calgary is called Everywhere We Are. It's being collaboratively run between Contemporary Calgary and Nickel Galleries at the U of C. So it officially is supposed to open today, but because of COVID, we're not sure when. Hopefully they'll be able to open their doors soon, but it will be on until August 15th, 2021. So Everywhere We Are is an exhibition and public programming series addressing the challenges, merits, impacts, and advantages associated with art collecting. It's made up of an art collector, Ken Bradley's own personal collection. So it's his art collection that he's been curating over the course of 30 years. The central theme of Everywhere We Are, it explores boundaries in art. So it poses questions about how or where art is distributed, how neuroscience is changing our understanding of art, and how collecting is a part of a complex ecosystem of relationships with artists, curators, collectors, commercial galleries, and public collections. So there are some of the exhibition objectives that focus in on art collecting, philanthropy, care and conservation, and just increasing awareness of Contemporary Calgary because it's such a new institution. So just drawing attention to that, as well as mentoring visual artists to facilitate relationships and build those relationships between collectors, galleries, museums, and curators. So public programming is a large part of this project. There's 6 major public programs. There's sacred art and expression, art and neuroscience, art and business, care and conservation, patronage and philanthropy, and collector and artist relations. So the targeted audience for the exhibit in general is pretty broad, basically just anyone with an interest in the arts or anyone with specialized interests. So the public programming is a little bit more specific. So people with vested interests in these areas, or again, just anyone who's interested. So these were my tasks in Everywhere We Are. So I created educational resources for the gallery and staff at the gallery. So this just meant gathering artist information, specific information regarding their individual artist practice, resources to links, personal anecdotes, interesting stories, things like that, just so everyone in the gallery can sort of be familiar with the works and the artists being exhibited. Second is I worked on one of the public programs. So I worked on the one that has to do with care and conservation, specifically about the 2013 flood response. So I just worked on doing some research, compiling links to articles and other important documentation regarding the governmental flood response, but also how the flood impacted the art scene in Calgary. And the third major thing I did was I wrote up exhibition didactics that are to be placed in the exhibition. And so these were just for each of the 37 artists to be featured in the collection. So just a brief rundown of their biographies, accomplishments, and the nature of their practices. Also just specific information about some of their most notable works. I also did some research on how the 37 artists to be featured are connected to Alberta specifically. So Kanika isn't quite sure what we're going to do with this information, but we think it's important to somehow connect it so the public knows how important Alberta is in regard to the contemporary art in Canada. So these are just artists that have either lived in Alberta or were born in Alberta, studied and did residencies in Alberta. So these are just some of my favorite collections from the work. Everything is quite striking in person. I was lucky enough to go in person, but these are just some of the mixed media works. So as you can see, there's some collage, there's sculptures, there's photographs. It's all pretty cool stuff. So these are what I think were the central aims of my practicum placement. So fostering a deeper understanding of art collecting and relationships which exist in the art world between artists, collectors, galleries, and the public, while also assisting with the exhibition planning and setup. And the second would be just gaining a more robust understanding of the actual management structures, so how contemporary Calgary is run, and all the different people involved. And the third, of course, is developing an appreciation for the role contemporary art plays in Canadian society and consciousness. I think this one's really important. And lastly, learn about why each of the artists to be featured in the exhibition are important to the exhibition objectives and the Canadian contemporary art scene. And these are some of my notable takeaways. So firstly, I would say that I've sort of gained a deeper understanding of how collaboration works in the gallery setting. So just between all of these different people, the social media specialists, curators, the public, and different institutions and individuals. Second, I was lucky enough to go in person to observe and sort of learn more about the exhibition installation process, which was really interesting to see. So I learned about how the art is actually stored, instructions for setup, and also just like the layout of the gallery and how it's physically altered to accommodate some of the works of art that are quite large or difficult. So that was really interesting. They drill holes in the wall and they tweak the ceilings and things like that. It's really cool. And the third would be public engagement. So I just kind of realized how important public engagement is and how important these interpretive programming initiatives are. So providing these resources and opportunities for conversation between the public and different individuals that are involved with the exhibition. I think that's important. And also providing an opportunity to act as resources for upcoming collectors, upcoming artists, or anyone who wants to be a part of this initiative or overall contemporary art scene. And the third is curatorship. So just working closely with Kanika, I really realized how curators really do juggle multiple responsibilities and oversee many operations in the exhibition process and just gallery in general. So I really appreciated just gaining a deeper understanding of what that entails. And lastly, I think this is a really important takeaway. So just gaining a deeper appreciation for the enduring importance and relevance of contemporary art. I think contemporary art is really relevant, especially now, just with the themes and subject matter that these works deal with. I think they can show us a lot and we can learn a lot from them. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nation. And for those of you who think, oh, everywhere we are, that sounds familiar. Well, it's because it was at the Nickel until COVID. Okay, thank you again. And our very last speaker today is Savannah Lee.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Savannah, and I got to do my practicum this year at the Calgary Public Library, which was really amazing. I'm an English major, minoring in museum studies, and my goal is to work in libraries. So Dr. Hardy was very nice to let me do my practicum at the library, which was really great. It definitely ended up being very unique in scope and format, especially compared to everyone else who's already presented. Which you'll see as we go. But because of the online, I ended up not just being at one branch or working on one project. I kind of got to have a more broad overview of the library, which was really great, I think, overall. I really got to see a lot more than I think I would have at a fully in-person practicum. So in a way, I do think that COVID worked in my favor in this way. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the first half or so of the practicum, I mostly spent in meetings with a variety of people across a bunch of departments with the organization. So this is a flow chart, which I am using with permission from CPL, of kind of the management departments and positions. And as you can see, it's quite varied, more so than I think a lot of people would think for a library. So I was able to meet with people across multiple departments, including service design, service delivery, Indigenous services, programming, collections, volunteer services, special services, as well as quite a few librarians from various branches. So I learned a few things from this. First, I learned how varied the field of librarianship can be as a career. There's so many areas that librarians can work in, and this is just a public library. That's not even talking about other types of libraries. I also learned that not everyone in a public library is a librarian. For example, many of the service design team do not have library degrees. They have backgrounds in things like early learning, education, technology, things like that. And I think that having that diversity of backgrounds is really beneficial because the library is better able to cater to its diverse community of patrons and also provide a wider range of programs and services that are being created by people who have expertise in these fields. This related to museum studies for me because I think that curators are often in a very similar situation these days. They have to wear a lot of hats, so to speak, and curators now often come from more diverse backgrounds than they would have in the past as far as education and experience go. Next slide, please. So on a broader level, libraries and museums have seen huge changes in their roles as public institutions in the last few decades. In museum studies, we refer to this shift as going from being about something to being for somebody. So in the past, libraries were mostly focused on their book collections and reference services, but today public libraries have really shifted to being community spaces for gathering, sharing, and learning. I read somewhere a few years ago that public libraries are the last free gathering space, and I think that that's very true. So yes, the library does still have books and they do still provide some reference services, but a majority of their focus is on programming and community outreach. And most of the people I met with were engaged in these two fields. Next slide, please. So as an example, I got to meet with the service design lead in charge of Indigenous services. And I learned about some of the steps that the library has been taking in the last few years to be more inclusive and aware of the Indigenous community in Calgary and the surrounding area. So for example, they have created what's called the Elders Guidance Circle, which is a group of elders who've partnered with the library to provide programs, and they hold meetings centered around Indigenous culture, history, and reconciliation. Currently, they're doing meetings online, of course, but in the past, they have an area in Central Library where they meet, which is on the top right of the screen there. That's part of their room that they meet in. Central Library also has an Indigenous Languages Resource Center, which is on the left-hand side of the screen there. And they do programming and meetings in that space as well. Some library branches have permanent art installations, Indigenous art installations, and they are planning on adding more to other branches in the coming future. The library also has a training program for all staff focused on Indigenous culture and protocols. And the library also recently purchased a number of ventilators so that Indigenous people can do smudging ceremonies within the library. So in short, the library is taking steps to create a space where Indigenous people can meet together to learn and to heal, and also a space where non-Indigenous people can come and be taught. And this echoes what's been happening in museums. We've talked a lot about this in museum studies classes about how museums are providing spaces for ceremonies and smudging and offerings and things like that. Museums are also a lot more cognizant of cultural protocols around objects and how to display them or not display them and how to handle them properly. In both cases, Indigenous people are being given spaces to tell their own stories. To be clear, I believe that CPL and all public institutions have a long way to go still towards reconciliation, but I do think that it's really hopeful to see these first steps being taken. Next slide, please. Another example of public outreach is that I got to sit in on some virtual programming and talk to some of the facilitators kind of about how that's been going with the move to online. And one thing that came up again and again was accessibility. Online programs are more accessible and they're more convenient. Some programs have seen a huge increase in attendance. since the library has moved to online, which I thought was really interesting. And everyone I talked to about programming said that they anticipate the virtual programming is here to stay. And there's even some talk about introducing hybrid programming once it's safe to do in person again. There was some discussion that the library would have moved to virtual programming eventually. It's just that the pandemic kind of forced them to do it earlier. Of course, there will still be in-person programming once it's safe to do so. But they have found that this has been really good for the community as far as reaching out to people who may have accessibility needs of any type, really, but also just more convenient in general for anybody. Museums are going through a similar shift. In Museum Studies 433 this semester, we had a guest lecture from some programmers at the Royal Alberta Museum, and I asked them this same question, and they said, oh yeah, virtual programming is here to stay. We're going to continue doing this. So I think that both libraries and museums are doing this experiment almost because of the pandemic to have to move towards virtual programming. Next slide, please. So the project that I did get to work on, aside from just all these various meetings that I had, I got to work on the My First Bookshelf initiative. My First Bookshelf is in collaboration with the Dolly Parton Imagination Library, which is a charity that sends children a free book every month. So in Calgary, this is just in the pilot stage, so it's only available in certain postal codes that were determined to have the highest needs towards early literacy and kindergarten readiness. So the Imagination Library does the actual mailing of the book and things like that. CPL just is kind of the middleman for registration, and they help with some of the funding. So CPL was looking to extend this program so that they could be more involved and to make this program be more about parent involvement and family engagement. So at first, the idea was that CPL would create some sort of activity booklet that would be sent to the families who were involved in the program. And it would have, literacy related activities and things like that, as well as like information for parents about early literacy. So I was tasked with helping out with this. I started out doing research on kind of what sort of resources are already out there, what kind of things could we add to this. So I got to look at different libraries in Canada, see what they're doing. I looked at nonprofits, government agencies, some publicly available educational resources, and I put all of that together. And then I was asked to kind of brainstorm about the project, like what this format would be, what kind of considerations we need to take. So at this point, we met as a team and we kind of determined to move the project in a bit of a different direction. So we decided to go more in the direction of a monthly parent newsletter that would kind of have these same resources, but emailed in a newsletter instead. So then I was asked to help draft some content for the newsletter and put a bunch of things together, come up with ideas for it, which was good because I had already gathered all these other resources. We also worked on some ideas around things like reading challenges and incentives to try and get families excited about early literacy and more involved. So working on this project, I learned a lot about how these kinds of initiatives evolve. We talked a lot about the needs of the community, and then things changed as we talked about those things. We were constantly aware of things like families' access to the internet, parental literacy levels, English proficiency, special needs, cultural considerations, and many other factors. Communities are diverse and they have diverse needs. And I don't think that any one program could ever cater to an entire community, but I think that both libraries and museums have to be really aware of who's using the institution and who's not, so that they can take steps to help to bring in people who are not using the programs and figuring out why, but also to better meet the needs of people who are already using the institution. Next slide, please. So as the practicum went on, I got to start going in person to the Country Hills branch to kind of observe library operations. The first few times were while libraries were closed. I did get to go once in that very brief window where libraries were open, which was really great. So normally public libraries are really public service oriented. A lot of the staff are out on the floor, they're out helping people. But of course, when the libraries were closed, these staff, their responsibilities completely shifted to kind of behind the scenes circulation processes. So that really taught me a lot about how this field, you have to be very adaptable and very flexible and ready to take new things on. So as I was there, I got to help out with some of these things. I got to help out with some weeding. I got to do some of the curbside pickup, helping with holds, things like that, which I really enjoyed. I love that kind of stuff. So to help the community a little better while they've been closed, the library has introduced a few new services that I also got to assist with. One being curbside printing, which is exactly what it sounds like. The other is the Build a Book bag service. So patrons can fill out just a simple form online and they can kind of request like an age range, topics, genres, things like that. And then the librarians go and pull books that they think would match that patron. And this has been super popular, especially with kids. So I got to do a few of those and kind of go through the kids collection and see what kind of books I thought would match what they're interested in. And that was really, really fun to do. And it was really good to see how the library is being very quick to offer new services to make up for the fact that they're closed. Next slide, please. Near the end of the practicum, I got to go to Central Library for a day, and I got to go behind the scenes and see some of the more centralized operations. I got to have a tour of the collection, and I learned about how the collection has changed since they moved from the old building to the new building a few years ago. For example, they did not bring a lot of their reference collection with them when they moved because most reference happens online. So they decided not to take up space with a reference collection that doesn't get used anymore. So I also had the opportunity to learn a lot about Calgary stories, which you can see in the pictures here. It's the local history and genealogy reference collection, which is housed at Central. It's non-circulating. It's really interesting. They have like old yearbooks from local high schools, Stampede programs, building plans, a bunch of newspaper clippings, all of that kind of stuff that's focused on Calgary. They use this collection. They offer some programs at Central about helping patrons to learn how to do genealogical research. And they do that in collaboration with some local genealogical societies, which I think is really great because things like, for example, the U of C library is really not set up for genealogy research. So it's great to have something in the city that is set up for that we can refer, the universities can refer people to and that people can go to and learn how to do this kind of stuff. The collection is housed directly next to the Elders Guidance Circle and the Indigenous Languages Resource Center, as well as a few Indigenous art displays, which I thought was really important and powerful because it serves, I think, as a visual reminder of what might not be in the collection and whose stories are not in Calgary's story. So I feel like it creates a space where Indigenous and settler stories can kind of exist in a dialogue with each other, and they kind of intersect in this one space. So I thought that was really powerful how they've set it up. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, my practicum at CPL gave me an opportunity to learn about public libraries, but it also really expanded my understandings of museum and heritage sites as a whole. A lot of museum theory applies to libraries, and both are undergoing really dramatic shifts as institutions right now. And I'm really excited to be part of that as I'm entering the field, as I'm graduating this semester. So I'd like to close by thanking Calgary Public Library, especially Chelsea Murray, who was my supervisor and got all these meetings set up and all of that. And also thank you to Dr. Hardy for the opportunity. And thank you all for listening.
All of you from Jill, and she writes, "Hi all, you did a fantastic job," and I concur. I'm with the University of Alberta Museums, and we're about to host 2 summer students. So this has been really insightful. That said, what was a challenging element to doing your practicum online, and what was rewarding, or what did you enjoy about doing it remotely? Any takers?
I can go.
Go ahead.
Just as a 4th year student doing a practicum, I'm very used to being self-driven. So you have to be willing to ask questions. So if you're naturally a shy person, it might be a little bit more difficult to be in a very open and communicative relationship with your supervisor. So I think that was might be a little bit challenging to some people, and I thought it was a little bit at first because I'm not used to doing online internships at all. It's the first time for me, but you catch on quite quickly after the first 2 weeks. Rewarding about it, just being able to produce something that I took time and effort to produce, that the organization I worked at will continue to use for their virtual programs, is a huge positive for me, and I find that very rewarding for myself because I worked very hard. I did a lot of research and worked very close to make sure it was very inclusive and followed the Calgary Stampede's 5 core values that I talked about in my presentation. But that's just me personally.
Thank you, Megan. Those are really good points. I can't remember who it was that said that, this kind of delivery of programming, this is here to stay. So whether we like it or not, it's here to stay. Did anybody else want to respond to that question?
I can just talk to it briefly. I was lucky enough to actually be able to go in once a week for the majority of my time, but there are some real benefits like with just flexibility for meeting with Zoom. It makes it a lot more able to fit in meetings, as well as just I feel like being a big thing is keeping the lines of communication open, as well as just having like even a weekly check-in was something that me and my supervisor did, which was really helpful, not only to stay on track, but just to always keep checking in to keep the project moving along.
Yeah, those are also really good points. Okay, any other questions? Maybe from I don't know if there's any students who are thinking about taking this program. There's chat comments. A wonderful potpourri of topics indeed. Thank you, Linda. For Anna, if one wanted to learn more about Camp 130 and the prisoner of war experience in Alberta, what would you recommend as an approach, especially if young family members are to be taught?
Yeah, that's a great point. So right now, currently at the site, there is some interpretation, but not a lot. And that's something that biogeoscience is really trying to work on. And this is kind of one of those ways that the hope is toward moving towards that. And that was kind of what I was hoping to do with the more thematic approach, that there are more topics that cover the history of the site, but they're more relatable things and questions that anyone at a young age might ask, like what was the things to eat, or what did you do in your free time? So yes, there are areas still to cover. The really historical parts of it being during World War II, but also connecting it to personalities and to specific people's experience. Takes that more narrative approach, which would be beneficial for someone of any age.
And thank you, Anna. Any other questions? I've always got a question. All right, I'm gonna take it. First of all, congratulations, all of you. I'm so pleased and so proud of the work that you've done under, exceptional circumstances. It was a tough semester, not least because, we're all sick and tired of COVID and sick and tired of screens. But, I really feel that the 5 of you persevered and dove in full-heartedly and really, really learned some important lessons. So bravo. My question, I think we've seen in 5 different situations the importance of connecting with community and the importance of kind of turning museums and libraries and galleries kind of more, changing them to become much more outward focus. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about, how you might, where you see that going in the future, how you might contribute to that in where you're going.
I can take that if you
Yeah, go for it, Emma. It was kind of vague.
I think so. I mean, the way I see it with my background is in bioanthropology, but anthropology nonetheless. So I'm very human-centered in my work. And I think with museums specifically, that anthropologists might step away from their sphere of kind of ethnographic research and move into a sphere of museum studies where we work on what is the common community or what is the society around us wanting from institutions. I think it's the institution, it's going to flip on its head if that makes sense, rather than the academics focused on what we need to teach the public. It'll be what the public wants to know, what they want to learn, what they want to experience and see. So I think that'll really become a big thing with community centeredness, more academics in the sphere whose sole purpose is to, like I said, go out to communities and chat with them and talk to them and see what people are wanting, and maybe even getting more community funding now that we're losing a lot of government funding, just specifically in Alberta. So I think that's kind of how we'll see that shift.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I was also just going to say, sometimes I feel like contemporary art can be off-putting to some people because they feel like they might not understand it, or it might not be for them or something. But I think in contemporary Calgary's case, it's really an experience. Like, you don't have to know all of the theory stuff behind it. It's just how it speaks to you. So I think making sure people know that, making sure that we reach them and make them feel welcome in the space, I think that's important too, whether it's through public programming or just going out and reaching the community in other ways.
Mm-hmm. We've certainly been aware at Nickel Galleries that it's not enough just to be there. Just because the doors are open and we're free, people still might not come. And we need to pay attention to that. Savannah or Megan, did you want to chime in?
I can, just as a historian, just being inclusive as a whole, as researching, I've done a lot. And a lot of the sources that Christine gave me to focus on an inclusive project, especially with their close relationship with, as I mentioned, the nations of Treaty 7. They're important sources and they're well-versed, but there are still issues in them, and you have to be important when you're taking inclusive stories and being inclusive to recognize that this is an improper word choice. So like, for example, I researched Tom Three Persons and they categorized him as a Canadian, and he's not technically recognized legally as a Canadian in 1912. So instead of that, I phrased it as Indigenous person. So rather than a Canadian victor at the Calgary Stampede. So that's really important, just to be aware of yourself when you're being inclusive is important.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Savannah, you're nodding.
Yeah, I could just add that I think that these kind of institutions are a lot more aware of their, I don't want to reduce people to statistics, but they are more aware of their statistics these days.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, Calgary Public Library actually they have a person on staff who is a data analyst who works for Calgary, who her job is to just look at the data, look at who's coming, who's not, what are the demographics of who's coming, which neighborhoods are going to the library, which neighborhoods are not. And then the library can take all of that data and look at, okay, well, maybe this branch in this neighborhood needs to offer different programs because of the demographics of that area, or, you know, they're not seeing people come into the library. And I think that museums can have, I mean, museums tend to be one location versus libraries being multiple locations, so it's a little different, but I do think that looking at that data is going to be more important moving forward in these kind of institutions, and I think we're going to see more and more of it. Maybe that'll even trickle into the museum studies programs. Maybe we will start forcing us to do math or something. Hopefully not, but
oh, we're going to be teaching you statistics. Yeah, well, I think there's definitely lessons on both sides. There's a quote, and I think this is probably a good place to finish off. Thank you, Linda. With regard to art, art is not an object, it's an experience. I believe that is now being taken into consideration by museums and galleries. Absolutely. We are much more interested in providing a much more welcoming and inclusive and accessible experience. So thank you all. Unless anybody else, anybody else has a question? I will stay on the line in case there's any students who would like to know about the program, but I will set the 5 of you free, and thank you all for joining us for Museum and Heritage Studies 533 this term. Thank you, Marla. There is one more nickel at noon next week. Paul, I expect to see you back. We'll stamp your card, and students, I will be in contact really soon. So have a great afternoon, everybody.